What's up, Avatar fans? So, we're going to branch out a little bit on this channel and we're going to start covering some Avatar related content. I already covered the trailer for the new Netflix series, and I do love this series so much that I think it's important to go over it, and in particular, covering the anime on its own, as well as covering what we might get to see in the coming season from Netflix. So, we're going to go over the top 5 best fight scenes in first season of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the first fight, which we're going to start from 5 going down, and the first is going to be the King of Omashu. Now, I picked this because it is the first earthbending fight that we ever saw, and honestly, it's one of the best in the series. We do get, obviously, like Imprisoned is a good example of earthbending fights, but honestly, there's no arguing with the sheer sense of scale and power that Bumi is able to give when he's fighting Aang. I mean, he basically lifts whole boulders, he turns the ground into sand or liquid, he shows nearly the full breadth of what an earthbending master can be. And I mean, it won't be until Toph, and particularly later Toph, that we see just how much further you can push an idea for earthbending. So, in terms of like early battles, the reason this one's so low is it's visually interesting, but it's not actually that dangerous because he didn't mean to kill anyone. And of course, this episode, while important, is not one of the more important in first season. It's a bit of background establishment for Aang, and it's a bit of setup for some other things that they'll need later. Now, this next battle will feature Earthbenders, but they're not really the ones we're focusing on, and that's because we're going to talk about Iroh and Zuko versus the Earth Kingdom soldiers. Now, I think it's kind of funny because of all the battles you could pick, this one is probably a little out there. It's more of a comedic battle in some ways, but honestly, I love the whole build-up to this fight as well as the fight itself. We get to see how clever Iroh is as a strategist, and we get to also see how creative you can actually be with firebending, which, if we're being honest, is probably the least creative element because, you make fire blasts. But we see him do things like being able to superheat his own iron shackles to burn a guy's hand. We see them use their firebending to disrupt earthbending. We even see that through martial training, Zuko is able to deliver a kick that essentially splits off iron shackles. That is a big deal, in my opinion, and it's kind of funny because it's like, again, this is not the most important battle, even though this was a life-or-death battle for both of them, but it was also a battle that kind of showed the relationship between Zuko and Iroh, because they had been kind of the comedy duo, Zuko being the bad guy chasing Aang, and Iroh being his uncle that just kind of seemed to tag along. This is the first time you started to get a genuine idea for maybe Iroh was a little bit more dangerous than you thought he was, and Zuko was incredibly loyal to his uncle. So this battle established a lot, it had some stakes to it, and it was a good example of what firebenders could be if they weren't up against characters with plot armor. So, for the next battle, I think it's going to be one that you would not pick out because there's so many great battles in Season 1, but I put this one at the midpoint because it's so fundamentally important for lore reasons, and that is the Battle of the Norn Air Temple. Now, you're probably thinking, why would I put that one here? I mean, it's a cool battle, don't get me wrong, but it's arguably one of the, least interesting battles because it's essentially a lot of using delay tactics and them trying to flip over the fire tanks and stuff. Now, the thing about this is that this episode kind of answered a very important question that I think was racing through a lot of people's minds. How did the Fire Nation get through the air nomads? And when I mean get through, I mean is they live up on mountains. How did the Fire Nation ever approach a bunch of airbenders in what is the most home court turf they could possibly have? And the answer to that is tundra tanks can climb. That is probably the best explanation for why the air nomads are no longer there, is that essentially the firebenders used this style of grappling technology to climb to the top, and that's where they waged their battle. The battle itself here is also kind of cool. We got to see a bit more of the technology and ingenuity side of an Avatar fight. Sokka got to really show his worth as a strategist in this fight, which was a very important detail, as he's kind of the team strategist going forward. I mean, even when other characters start to join, benders and expert fighters and stuff, he's still the one that kind of has to lead everyone cohesively, and this was the first battle where we really saw that. Plus, this episode also establishes how the Fire Nation will get a hold of airships, which obviously become a key plot point far later in the series. Overall, this was actually a very important battle. I just know it's not one that a lot of people tend to talk about because there are other ones that come out ahead of it. Speaking of which, the Blue Spirit. Yeah, I kind of had to pick this because it is such a significant and important battle. I mean, it's kind of interesting when you look at this episode. It was the first time that Aang and Zuko technically ever worked together, which was kind of cool, even if Aang didn't know that it was Zuko at the time. It's also very important because it was one of the first instances of, really, what's the best way I can put this? Seeing Zuko's abilities without his firebending. As the blue spirit, he had to basically use only his martial skills, in particular his sword dueling ability, and this was the first time he ever got to show it off. And it looked awesome. And fighting back to back with Aang was a big deal, and it being shown here was going to always, I think, leave an impression with a lot of us. I think that this was also the episode where, even though it wasn't necessarily the intent with this episode, a lot of people saw the possibility of Zuko joining Team Avatar, because even if it was only spite to keep, Zhao from claiming the Avatar, he did work with them, at least showing that he could put his feelings aside, at least for a little bit. In regards to that too, this episode showcased a lot of the more stealth-driven ideas that we hadn't seen a lot of in Avatar up to this point in time. We talk a lot about battles, and battles are very important in Avatar, but sometimes how benders will use their other abilities can be really fascinating. And in particular here, there's no bending at all. Zuko has to sneak into a maximum security fortress in order to rescue Aang, and then tries to get him out. Now, obviously, that does end up resolving in a fight, which is the reason it's on the list. But it's important to note the setup here established some things that would be important far later in the series. And then the last one is going to be the Siege of the Northern Water Tribe. Yeah, I'm going to cheat a little bit and put the two-parter on this, because if for no other reason, it really is one of the best battles in the whole series. Everything from the Fire Nation's initial siege, to the Waterbenders fighting back, to the loss of the Moon Spirit, to Aang merging with the Ocean Spirit, to Zuko kidnapping Aang, to Katara and the gang getting it back. There's just too many great instances to count, but I would count it overall as one extremely large battle with multiple moving pieces. And that's a key aspect here, because while I could count any individual aspect of this as a great battle, and they certainly all would be, altogether it forms the interweaving tale of the siege. And that's the important aspect here, is that this was also kind of, if we're being really frankly honest, an epic set piece. Avatar was awesome. It had great world building, there were great fights, there were great characters, but this was, I think, really the first time that it had started to feel epic. Like there was more on the line than just the personal journey, even though that's the way it had always been. But this is where you started to feel it. This was an entire city of people under siege, and they were going to be in danger if Aang and the gang lost this. So in my opinion, this was also one of the most important. And plus, for as much as we rag on spirits and the stuff that would happen later in Korra, the demonstration here of the pure power that was involved from using the Ocean Spirit merging with Aang is just epic to watch every time. There's such a deep reverence towards it that it's not even like just a kaiju showed up and wrecks the enemy military. It's a deeply spiritual thing that you feel through all the waterbenders. And even the way that the Ocean Spirit moves in this state doesn't quite look like a rampaging monster. It still looks like liquid flowing water, even as it destroys the enemy. I think that kind of adds a unique layer to this particular battle. So overall, I still have to place this as the top spot as the most impressive battle of Season 1. But why don't you guys let me know what you thought was the most impressive battle and what you want to cover and hope to see in the new Netflix series. Do you think they're going to cover all these, only a couple of them? Let me know. Hey there. So according to my statistics, this is about the time that YouTube retention starts to drop off. So before you pop out,